We are 20 years to the month where ECW, the original ECW Extreme Championship Wrestling, ran their last show, which was January the 13th, 2001 in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. I've been there many times. There's a great DoubleTree down in Pine Bluff. But ECW kind of, they would later go bankrupt in 2001. The last show was January. What did you make at the time when ECW did go under or stopped running the shows? And do you think if they had kept going, would it have changed the landscape of any wrestling, given everything else that happened in 2001?
Well, it would have changed the landscape of WWF, because a lot of the talent that went to WWF after ECW folded wouldn't have gone there. They would have stayed in ECW. So it would have changed that. It was clearly over for the company. They'd had such a difficult 2000, certainly the second half of that year. People were leaving. Most of the talent were behind on pay. Morale was going through the floor. The whole TNN TV experiment had been a washout. Paul Heyman, I think, was totally frazzled creatively. I just don't think he really had anything new to offer ECW. His best years creatively, I've always said, were 94 to 96. And I think he just ran ragged. He was where he had so many things to do. He couldn't really concentrate on the booking. And, maybe he just didn't have any fresh ideas. Some bookers only have like a good few years in them. But the pressure of actually running ECW in the 7-day weeks and the just never-ending mouse wheel that he was on, by end of 2000, early 2001, the company was pretty much finished. The story of why it went under is not something we can cover here because it's a very long, complicated story. But basically, they just ran out of money. Heyman wasn't even there for the last 2 house shows they ran that weekend. Tommy Dreamer ran the shows. I understand that Heyman didn't want to face the talent because they had so many questions for him which he couldn't answer. And then when he turned up on Raw on, I think it was March 5th that year, by Jim Ross's side after Jerry Lawler had quit previous week, that's when everyone knew it was over for ECW. But as I understand it, some ECW performers were still clinging to hope that ECW might continue. Heyman might find the funding from somewhere. He might strike that deal with that TV company that was going to put him on the air and was going to give him that cash injection that was going to save the organization. And when Heyman showed up on WWF on Raw that night, they realized, yep, it's over. It's finished. There's no way back. And there wasn't. And ECW ended up in bankruptcy court later that year. And as we know, Vince McMahon, WWF at the time, or WWFE, ended up purchasing the rights to the trademarks, and including the Dudleys, get the tables, Kenny. They weren't allowed to, remember that? They weren't allowed to use that phrase in TNA. They had to get the crowd to do it.
Crazy. Yeah, it was crazy. The other thing is, what people don't realize is if ECW had not went under, then the Invasion would look really different because you didn't have guys like RVD and Tommy Dreamer to come in, because that Invasion needed bolstering by ECW because the WCW talent they brought in, they either wasted like DDP or were not of a name value that you could really take seriously against the WWF.
Yeah, actually, that's a correction there. WWF, I think the Get the Tables thing actually was a WWF invention. It was the Dudley Boys name that was an ECW invention, and they weren't allowed to use that in TNA. That's why they became Team 3D. Just want to make that correction there, Kenny. Sorry. Team 3D in TNA.
But do you remember when you... No, you go.
Yeah, it was the whole thing with it. Sorry, what was the question again? It was about the alliance, wasn't it, with DDP and...
Well, because I was saying, with ECW, if ECW hadn't gone under, then WWF wouldn't have been able to use ECW, RVD, Tommy Dreamer. The Invasion would have suffered had ECW not been able to be involved, because that bolstered the chances of it working.
Well, absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, I imagine they would have still purchased WCW and attempted a version of it, but without, Heyman and, as you say, Rob Van Dam and Dreamer and others who became part of the alliance, the ECW and WCW pact that was formed between the performers that used to wrestle for those companies. And it's hard to believe, really, that the WWF versus, Alliance, the Invasion storyline would have been as good as it was. And lots of people have complaints about how weak it was and that it should have been better than it was, which is, obviously a fair criticism. I think in July, August, it was pretty hot. Obviously, the Invasion pay-per-view was a huge success on pay-per-view. I thought SummerSlam that year was very enjoyable as well. That did well on pay-per-view. But a lot of that, of course, was driven by Steve Austin turning heel. Obviously being a heel before the start of the Invasion pay-per-view, then briefly turned babyface, then turned heel again at the Invasion pay-per-view. So, I mean, Austin was obviously the guy driving the numbers there for the Alliance. And had he not been involved, I mean, I don't know what they would have done with it, Kenny. It would have been... I think it would have been a real struggle to try and sell that team as a threat to WWF, especially if Austin had been part of the WWF. If he'd been on the babyface team opposing the Alliance, who would have been the figurehead? I guess it would have been Booker T, probably. And that would have been a sell, I think, for the Alliance to be seen as, this menace that threatened the very existence of the WWF. So you're right. It would have been very different. Obviously, you look back on it, and it would have been great if WWF had just paid for, say, Nash and maybe Hogan, and just struck deals with these ex-WCW guys that were obviously prior to that WWF guys, and Goldberg as well. But they weren't willing to pay out 7 figures to buy these guys out of their WCW contracts. So, I mean, you look back on it and you just think, well, that investment in this talent would have been, to me, would have been rewarded at the box office and on pay-per-view if you'd had, say, Hogan, Goldberg, and, say, Nash, and maybe even Scott Steiner involved with the Alliance. I think it would have been remembered and would have been much bigger than it was. And I think whatever money they had to pay out to WCW or to those talents to buy them out of their WCW contracts, they would have made it back, what did you say, 3-5 times over? I think it would have been sage investment. I think it would have been a good investment for WWF, and they would have made the money back many times over. And then would have been, I think, in a really good position as well for the post-Alliance period, because you could have then had Hogan and Nash, Steiner and Goldberg doing different things that were not part of that Invasion storyline. So it could have been much bigger and better than it was. But as we know, WWF wasn't willing to spend the money. And also, if Hogan and Nash had been involved, I think Vince would have been more inclined to push them because he would have seen them as his own creations. And there wouldn't have been that resentment that was there from Vince and Kevin Dunn that, we can't be pushing these guys who are not our creations and making them appear to be WWF's equal. We've spent all these years telling our audience that WWF's better than WCW and ECW. And now if we show in the booking that we were wrong and they're better than WWF, then we're going to look like fools. So, I mean, that was very much the mentality that was driving the end of the Alliance WWF feud at Survivor Series of 2001, which to me was really short-sighted. But hey, it's their company, Kenny, and it's up to them, and that's what they did.
And that's what they did. And that's pretty much all the time we've got for today. I should mention, though, that one of the other things that Paul Heyman and ECW going under did bring you personally was your favourite duo on commentary, Jim Ross and Paul Heyman. Otherwise, we would have ended up with, God forbid, Jim Ross and Michael Cole for the whole of 2001. But, it doesn't bear thinking about. But we appreciate all of you.
You are right, Kenny. Absolutely. They were tremendous. They were one of the highlights of it. And they just lit up the airwaves, just like the tension was palpable at the desk. You know, to this day, it's still my favorite announce team.